Well, thank you for being here. I'm Rick Reames, the director of the South Carolina Department of Revenue, and we're talking about an important initiative that we are unveiling for the 2016 tax filing season. And the initiative is an anti-fraud initiative. Income tax refund fraud has reached pandemic levels in the United States, and it is a multi-billion dollar problem, which we're going to talk about a little bit more. And we're committed to stopping it. And so part of the reason we are here today is to explain to the public what happens when we unveil this anti-fraud initiative. To help explain it and to help the agency do a better job protecting taxpayers, we have a friend of mine, Frank Abagnale, who is sitting to my left. Frank should need no introduction. Frank is the subject of an internationally famous movie known as Catch Me If You Can, where Leonardo DiCaprio played him and described some of his earlier escapades, which I think he may talk about a little bit. Frank is a South Carolina resident, and we're fortunate to have him working with the Department of Revenue. He has worked with the FBI for 40 years and also consults with some of the world's top companies in the areas of cybersecurity and anti-fraud initiatives. And so Frank, being a South Carolina resident, has volunteered his time to help our agency and to help protect the public, and so we appreciate his time. So Frank, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you talk a little bit about part of the reason that we're doing this initiative, and then when you finish painting that picture, I can talk specifics about South Carolina's initiative.
Well, first of all, as Rick mentioned to you, I've been working with the FBI for 40 years. I've taught at the FBI Academy for 40 years, and I, of course, lectured on the subject all over the world and written a number of books on the subject. I do work for companies on retainer like Experian and LexisNexis, who deal with government issues and government risk solutions. Each are competitors of each other, but I work for both of them as a consultant to those companies. And this is a problem I've been working with for about 40 years. Right now in America, at the close of 2015, fraud, white-collar crime, was at about $958 billion in the United States, approaching $1 trillion. This is white-collar crime. This has nothing to do with burglary, robbery, theft of property, drugs, narcotics, or violent crime. This is strictly white-collar related crimes. Last year, as you know, the government, the IRS, paid out $5.6 billion in tax refunds to people who filed for those refunds using somebody else's identity. The government accounting office says they expect that the federal government will put out $21 billion in fraudulent claims through the IRS and tax refunds during the year 2016. Last year, at the close of 2015, Medicare and Medicaid paid out $100 billion of the taxpayers' money in fraudulent claims, or 10% of their combined budget. We had $7.7 billion paid out in unemployment fraud. The interesting thing is that the people who are committing these crimes are not American citizens, not South Carolinians. These are people over in Russia and Middle Eastern countries, people who are defrauding the United States and stealing the taxpayers' money, and then taking that tax money back to Russia or China or wherever the crime is originated from, and then bringing that money, because I'm a big believer in following the money and been teaching agents to follow the money for 40 years. You have to follow the money. And if you follow the money, you find out that the money comes back into our country in the form of drug trafficking, human trafficking, child pornography. So it is ironic that we as Americans allow people to steal, who are not even in this country, billions of dollars of the hard-earned money of the taxpayers of this country, take that money and then bring it back in to commit worse and more hideous crimes against the citizens of this country. Now, Rick has heard me speak a number of times over the years at the state tax convention, where we meet with all the state directors of the tax offices, federal conferences. And about a little over a year and a half, Rick approached me to say, I want to do something about this fraud problem. I don't want to wait till there's a big fraud problem. I want to do something about it. I don't want to be reactive. I want to be proactive. And that amazed me in itself, because I deal with a lot of government people who don't want to do anything, don't even want to acknowledge the problem, because that will cause them a lot more work or headaches. Rick approached me a year and a half ago and said, I'd like you to come to work as a consultant to tell me what these issues are so that I can deal with these issues. And I told him that because I was a citizen of the state, I'm not going to take any money from the state, that I'd be more than happy to help him in any way I can and assist him in any way I can, and I have done that. But I have to acknowledge that Rick is one of the few people within government that really sees a problem coming down the road, knows it's a problem, and is looking to do something about it. And there are very few people willing. It's not easy. You know, it's very simple to sit back and say, I'm not going to worry about it. Nobody's telling me to do it. So I'll just do my job, collect my check, and go on about my business. He's very concerned about these frauds and these crimes being committed, and especially in the state of South Carolina. So he's doing something very proactive about it. And if someone has to wait 3 more weeks to get their money, there's nothing wrong with waiting a couple more weeks if you know you're going to keep billions of dollars out of the hands of some criminals. As I told someone once, in my 40-year career, I used to work in the millions of dollars, and I only work in the billions of dollars. All the crimes are billions of dollars. And I used to work with people who defrauded banks and financial service companies and corporations. Now I only deal with people who defraud the government, federal, county, state, and city. And what I have found over my career is that the criminals realize that's where the money is. They're going to the government and to state government because not only is it the easiest target, but it's also the one that has all the money. So the criminals overseas have realized I'd much rather go rob from a state government than rob from a financial institution. And there are a lot more security and risk things in place probably within that private bank than there is within a government agency. So the government's become a big target, whether it be federal, county, state, or city. So we have to acknowledge that. We know that's a problem. And a lot of this stems from very simple things. For example, a number of years ago, I filed a return. I had to do it on paper. So I filed a return. I sent my W-2 in. I returned it into the tax office. They took all the paperwork. They went through it. They matched the W-2 to make sure it was real, that my employer did, in fact, pay me that money. It might have took 6 or 8 weeks for me to get a return because of just all the paperwork. The federal government processes 153 million returns during the month of April. So when they have all these returns, they used to go through them, look at them, inspect them. Then we moved to electronic payments, and the legislators said, you need to pay this in 21 days, no later. So if someone files electronically, they need to have the money in 21 days. It's impossible. You cannot look at something, verify something's correct. Maybe that company hasn't even filed the W-2 because they don't have to file till the end of January. And I'm looking at a W-2 someone made up and did that. So this is a lot of what the problem is that we've moved along and we have legislators saying do this, which is the impossible, and then we have all of these losses. Of course, no one wants to be that senator or that legislator that says, no, you know what, we got to stop and take 2 months to do a return, or we got to hold up the money a little bit till we verify it. No one wants to be that person to do that. So I give a lot of praise, and I'm happy to be able to work with South Carolina because there's someone who wants to be proactive about this and do something about it.
Thank you, Frank. And you heard him say that he was volunteering his time. With all that praise, I want to make sure you understand that he's not paid endorsing me. But thank you for that, Frank. So with that perspective on the national tax fraud problem, let's talk a little bit about what we're doing in South Carolina. Because as Frank mentioned, the IRS expects to pay out $21 billion in fraudulent income tax refunds this year. $21 billion with a B. And that's criminals stealing money from your government. And the criminals are not satisfied stealing from the federal government. They're moving to the states. And so you have seen over this past tax filing season a number of states come forward with anti-fraud initiatives, and we're one of them. And so we're going to attack the fraud in several ways. But the first is we're going to unveil a predictive analytics platform that actually uses data and matches that data to the tax return. And so this will result in us flagging fraudulent returns and stopping the fraud and preventing the criminals from stealing the government's money. The second way that this initiative is working is through collaboration and partnership with the IRS, other states, and the tax software industry. So I'm proud to say that South Carolina has been a leading partner in this national fight through the collaboration and through the working groups that have been formed at the national level. We're also working actively with companies like Intuit and ADP to make sure that we get the information that reports individuals' income amounts early enough to be able to reconcile it and stop the fraud. And the third way that this tax filing initiative is going to combat tax fraud is by partnering with and educating the public and asking the public to do their part in understanding the size of the problem and what it means to them and how their returns will be impacted. And so that's part of the reason you're here, is to help the public understand what's going on in this world and how the state is working to protect their money. And let me take a step back. I was talking about the 2016 initiative that we are rolling out today, but we're also attacking this problem systemically. What has happened, as Frank has mentioned, is that government payments are the target of fraud everywhere. And that's because there is so much money moving via electronic means to the recipients. When you have that much money moving electronically, you're going to see people trying to steal it. In South Carolina, we have let refunds grow in number and size. And so there are so many refunds out there, and they have gotten so large that it is a big target for fraudsters. And we're working to reduce withholdings so that over the next 10 years, this problem will be fixed systemically, so that there's not such a large pool of money and there's not the large quantity of refunds out there to attack. So with that, we're going to open it up for questions for Frank or me. And some of our folks around the table may ask questions too, because we are taping this for further use. Questions? Jack?
Go ahead and elaborate on the delays in refunds this year.
And so because of the anti-fraud initiatives, we do expect delays in taxpayers receiving their refunds. We're not going to process any refunds until around March 1st, and that's to enable the department to evaluate and reconcile the data. We do not anticipate that this being a significant delay in past years, but frankly, we've got to move past the model of getting individuals their money as quickly as possible. We have an obligation to get it to the correct person and keep the theft down.
There was some initial reporting indicating that some people who are in the tax preparation business were unaware of this initiative. Is that correct?
Well, this is a nationwide problem, and you're seeing a lot of other states doing exactly what we're doing, and there have been active working groups on the federal level over the past year. So tax preparers are aware that fraud is a pandemic, because they tell me regularly that when they file returns on behalf of their clients, they get rejected because someone has already filed a return. But to your point, that's why we're holding events like this, to push the word out.
What is state law currently? You mentioned 21 days, but does state law require anything in terms of a turnaround?
State law does not require refunds issued within any turnaround time period. If the state does not issue refunds by July 1st, the state's required to pay interest on it.
Go back to what you mentioned earlier about reducing withholdings. You want to work over a period of years to discourage people from getting big refunds. You want those refunds to be smaller?
What we want is we want individuals to be able to keep their money throughout the year rather than lending it to the government, because that's what withholding is that individuals have their tax amounts withheld by their employer and sent to the government, only to receive those amounts back when they file their tax return that spring. So by reducing the withholdings, we're enabling the individuals to keep their money throughout the year, and also enabling the state to reduce the refunds, both the size and the frequency.
And how are you going to be able to do that? I mean, some people prefer to have large withholdings so that they save something instead of spending it when it's available.
And that's a fair point, and it's one we're mindful of. It's not the government's obligation to force a savings account on individuals. And so what we're doing is we're putting the money back in the taxpayers' hands. We're going to save the costs and the efforts of refunding the money, so that saves the agency money, and it also helps alleviate this fraud problem, because it's a whole lot easier to find fraud in a smaller number of refunds.
How much money have South Carolina residents lost over the last few years to this kind of fraud?
Well, as we just said, at the federal level, it's a $21 billion problem, and there's 50 states. So it's a huge dollar issue. We don't release details on that, and Frank can probably tell me that he recommends I suspect, to his Fortune 100 clients that they not do that as well. But
No, I think the point is that, let's just say, for example, if you had $500 million and you cut those losses by $500 million, that's $500 million goes back into the state budget to feed the needy, to find homes for the homeless, to do good things with that money rather than give it to criminals who are not even in this country. So anything that you save goes back to people in the state, and it's the people's money. You know, I'm a big believer that if you don't do anything about crime, you're just encouraging more crime. So you have to take a position and take a step to prevent crime. And of course, the tax refunds are popular now because the dollar amounts are great. $7,000 refunds, $10,000 refunds, $12,000 refunds. If the refunds were like they were years ago, $200, $300, it wouldn't have the appeal to criminals. But because the refunds have gotten so high and there's so much money at stake, that's one of the reasons it has such appeal.
Rick, did I understand you to say that the rise of electronic filing has sort of exacerbated the problem of fraud?
Well, what it has done is it has created a model where the government views its role as getting the money to the recipient as fast as possible. And as a result of that, it's more difficult to reconcile the data. At the same time, a criminal who used to rob banks can sit in Eastern Europe on a computer and steal from the government rather than robbing banks.
But to be honest with you, the absolute truth is that if tomorrow I filed a return with the IRS and filed a W-2 that I made up in my mind and said that I worked for this company in South Carolina and they paid me $250,000 and I paid in this much money and you owe me this much money, they would send me the money. No one would verify that or check that out. And that's absurd.
And that's a large part of the reason we're unveiling this initiative. Government does a lot of things poorly. One of the things that it's great at doing is kicking the can down the road, and we can't afford to continue to kick the can down the road on this problem.
If South Carolina detects a fraudulent tax return, you're going to tell the IRS?
Yes, that's one of the main benefits of working in partnership with this collaborative effort that I talked about earlier. The IRS and the states and the software preparation industry is working together, which is a huge step forward to tackle this problem at the global level. And so the answer to your question is yes, there's information flowing both ways now, which is a step in the right direction.
Yes.
The case before?
Correct.
Right, and because if I filed a false return in South Carolina and got money, I'm going to do the same thing in Georgia, Alabama, Virginia. So states need to start talking to each other, and so they know they're sharing data with each other, so they know that someone who's trying to perpetrate a crime against them has already done so in another state.
You've been working with Draft Mail with software companies. Can you give us any kind of a reading on how secure the software is?
I do work as a consultant to Intuit. I don't work on their tax preparation side. I work on their QuickBooks and Quicken side to help their 4.5 million small businesses not be defrauded that have that work through Intuit. But I know that Intuit has put in, as a company, has put in tremendous amount of security within their company and their software. But every company can be breached. Every breach occurs because somebody in that company did something they weren't supposed to do, or somebody in that company failed to do something they were supposed to do. So no matter how sophisticated your system is, a human being has to operate it. So if you have someone within that company and they sell the information, or you have someone in that company who didn't put in the proper firewalls, didn't put in the proper technology, you're going to have a breach. So there have been thousands and thousands of breaches. There's breaches every day. We've already had 875 million electronic files hacked into in the United States. There are only about 340 million people living in the country. So, you know, those things are going to occur. So you have to make sure that you put as much of security as you can, you cut down your risk as much as you can, and take a very proactive position. You're not going to stop it completely, but you certainly can put a big dent in it. And I think what Rick wants to do, if it's a problem, he wants to cut it by at least 50%, because that's a lot of money that goes back into the taxpayer and goes back into do some good with that money.
But Jack, as a follow-up to that, through these collaborative efforts on the national level, I'll tell you that the software providers are keenly interested in this. And for the first time, it is a focus of these working groups. And so we hope to see improvement on that.
Do you have any stats on number-wise, percentage-wise, how many people file before and after March 1st?
We can get you that data. I don't have it off the top of my head, but we clearly keep data on timing of filing. So, Shauna, let's talk afterwards.
Mr. Abagnale, it's been a number of years since the story that sort of inspired the movie had past. Are you still comfortable with being identified as the catch me if you can guy? Have you do? Are you okay with that?
Yeah,
Anything you want to say about that?
You know, it's funny you should say that because yesterday or the day before, Fortune magazine ran an article because I've been selected as an advisor to a technology company out in California developing very sophisticated technology for the government to be able to verify the person on the other end of the computer is in fact the real person. This is for CIA agents and et cetera. And the Fortune magazine, which wrote about me, started the article with technology company hires con man. Not former, not retired, but con man. So, you know, I deal with that. That's part of my life. And, you know, I did those things 50 years ago when I was a teenage boy. I obviously served my time. I repaid all the money some 30 years ago. Been married for 40 years. I have 3 sons. My oldest boy is an FBI agent. So I feel that, you know, I'm constantly trying to pay my debt back to society. But I always know that people are going to refer to me from the movie or something like that, and that's just part of life and something you have to deal with.
You think you can help Mr. Reames figure out who hacked our computers a few years ago?
I can help him with anything he asks me to help him with. I'm there to help him.
Any other questions?
Well, one point of clarification I might want to make is that the March 1st, is that we will be processing prior to March 1st. This is not, our system will be on all systems.
Right. So when we came out with our press release to make sure people understood that there might be a slight delay in receiving refunds, the date that we set was March 1st for people to look for their refunds, no matter how early they had filed. We hope to get refunds sooner than that, and we will be working and actively processing returns prior to that. But what we want to make sure is that people have a reasonable expectation on that point. Is that fair, Ashley? All right. Looks like we're finished. We appreciate everybody being here. Appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you.